In 1805, an Albanian officer named Muhammad Ali seized power in Cairo and set out to drag Egypt into the modern age. He built factories, dug irrigation canals, and conscripted peasants into a European-style army. He planted cotton across the Nile Delta, transforming the fields of the fellahin into an engine of export wealth. By the 1820s, Egyptian cotton was flowing into the mills of Manchester and Lyon, and silver was flowing back into Muhammad Ali's treasury. But modernization was expensive. New schools, shipyards, and railways demanded capital that Egyptian agriculture alone could not supply. His successors inherited both the ambition and the appetite for foreign money. When Ismail Pasha became Khedive in 1863, he carried the dream to its dazzling extreme. Educated in Paris, Ismail declared that Egypt was no longer part of Africa, but of Europe. He rebuilt Cairo with wide boulevards modeled on Baron Haussmann's Paris, installed gas lamps, opened an opera house, and laid over 1,000 miles of railway and 8,000 miles of telegraph line. He constructed hundreds of bridges and sugar factories, and expanded the port of Alexandria. Every project glittered, and every project required loans. European bankers in London and Paris were eager to lend. They saw in Egypt a young state flush with cotton revenue and a ruler desperate to appear civilized in Western eyes. The terms they offered were harsh, but Ismail signed them, confident that cotton would pay for everything. Between 1862 and 1873, Egypt's foreign debt climbed from £3 million to over £68 million. The Khedive treated credit as if it were tribute, borrowing against future harvests that had not yet been sown. He spent lavishly to earn his title as a modernizer and to fund a grander vision still taking shape in the eastern desert. There, thousands of laborers were already digging a channel meant to join two seas and crown Egypt as the crossroads of the world. It would become the most celebrated engineering feat of the century. It would also become the wound through which Egypt's independence slowly bled away. The Suez Canal was about to cost the country everything. In 1854, a French diplomat named Ferdinand Lesseps secured a concession from Egypt's ruler to build a canal linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. The Suez Canal Company was formed, and Egypt was bound to it by ruinous terms. Construction began in 1859 near a barren spot that would become Port Said. The scale was staggering, a channel over 100 miles long, cut through sand, salt marsh, and rock. To dig it, Egypt supplied not only money but men. Under the corvée system, the government conscripted tens of thousands of peasants each month, marching them into the desert with little food and less water. Estimates of the dead range into the tens of thousands, felled by cholera, thirst, and exhaustion. When international pressure forced Egypt to abandon forced labor in 1863, the company demanded compensation. An arbitration by Napoleon III in 1864 ordered Egypt to pay millions in penalties for withdrawing the very laborers the Khedive had been shamed into freeing. The financial burden mounted with every year of digging. Egypt held nearly 44% of the company's shares, yet had committed to covering enormous costs while receiving little immediate return. The treasury poured in an estimated £16 million, funds raised increasingly through foreign loans at punishing interest. The canal that promised prosperity was quietly draining the nation that hosted it. On November 17, 1869, the waterway opened in a spectacle of imperial theater. Empress Eugénie of France sailed through aboard the yacht Aigle. Fireworks lit the sky over Ismailia. Ismail hosted European royalty in newly built palaces, staged banquets for thousands, and commissioned festivities said to cost over £1 million. Foreign guests marveled at Egyptian generosity, never glimpsing the ledgers behind the fireworks. The canal instantly became one of the world's most vital arteries, shortening the voyage from Europe to India by thousands of miles. But it earned its profits for shareholders in Paris, not for the peasants who had died digging it. Egypt owned the ditch and drowned in the bill. And just as the loans came due, the source of Egypt's wealth was about to vanish overnight. The wealth that made Ismail reckless came from a single white fiber. Egyptian cotton, long stapled and prized by European mills, had grown steadily in value since Muhammad Ali's day. Then, in April 1861, war erupted across the Atlantic. The American Civil War severed the flow of southern cotton to Europe. The Union blockade choked the ports of the Confederacy, and the mills of Lancashire fell silent, starved of raw material. In this vacuum, Egyptian cotton became gold. Prices exploded. Between 1861 and 1864, the value of Egyptian cotton exports quadrupled. Fields that once fed the population were plowed under and replanted with cotton. Peasants who had grown wheat now grew cash crops for foreign looms. Egypt's export revenue soared from roughly £4 million to over £16 million within a few years. Cairo and Alexandria filled with new money, speculators, and European merchants chasing the boom. Ismail read the surge as proof that his borrowing was wise. If cotton could quadruple, then future harvests would surely repay every loan. He accelerated his spending, mortgaging the country against a price that could not last. Bankers encouraged the illusion, lending against inflated projections as if the war would never end. But wars do end. In April 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. American cotton returned to the world market, and the artificial scarcity that had enriched Egypt evaporated. Prices tumbled. By the late 1860s, Egyptian cotton had lost much of its wartime value, and the revenue that underpinned Ismail's empire of loans crumbled beneath him. The mirage dissolved. Egypt was left with fields converted to cotton, a population that had shifted from food to export, and debts calibrated to prices that no longer existed. The gap between what Egypt earned and what it owed widened into an abyss. To service old loans, the Khedive did the only thing he knew how to do. He borrowed again. Each new loan carried worse terms than the last, and each one deepened the trap. The bankers of Europe had discovered that a desperate borrower will accept any price, and Egypt was about to learn just how ruinous that price would be. By the late 1860s, Egypt was no longer borrowing to build. It was borrowing to survive. Each loan existed to pay the interest on the last, a spiral the bankers of London and Paris understood perfectly and exploited without mercy. The mechanism was brutal in its arithmetic. When Egypt issued bonds, it rarely received the face value. A loan advertised at nominal value might deliver only 70 or even 60% of that sum in actual cash, the difference pocketed by underwriters as discount and commission. Yet Egypt owed interest and repayment on the full nominal amount. The 1868 loan carried a nominal value near £12 million. Egypt saw only a fraction reach its treasury. The 1873 loan, one of the largest, was issued at a nominal £32 million but yielded far less, while binding Egypt to crushing annual payments. Effective interest rates climbed past 12, sometimes 13%, on money that arrived heavily shaved. Houses like the Anglo-Egyptian Bank and the Fruehling and Goshen firm grew rich on the churn. Every renegotiation added fees. Every rescue loan planted the seeds of the next crisis. Ismail signed because he had no choice. Refusing meant immediate default, and default meant the vultures would descend at once. To meet the payments, Egypt squeezed the fellahin. The land tax was collected years in advance. Tax farmers extracted dues by the whip, and villages were bled dry to feed distant coupon holders. The Mukabala Law of 1871 raised money by promising peasants a permanent tax reduction in exchange for 6 years of prepaid taxes, a desperate scheme that mortgaged the future for present cash. Nothing stopped the bleeding. By 1876, Egypt's public debt had swollen to nearly £100 million. Servicing it consumed the majority of state revenue. A country that a generation earlier had bankrolled a canal now could not pay its own clerks. Ismail searched frantically for one great asset he could sell, one lump sum large enough to buy time. He owned something the great powers desperately wanted, a controlling block of shares in the Suez Canal itself. and a hungry buyer was already sailing toward him. By 1875, Ismail was cornered. His debts were monstrous, his creditors circling, and his treasury empty. He held one prize of immense value, 602 shares in the Suez Canal Company, roughly 44% of the enterprise, the single largest block in existence. It was Egypt's stake in the waterway its own peasants had dug and died for. Ismail needed cash immediately, and the shares were the only asset grand enough to raise it. Word reached London that the Khedive was seeking a buyer, and that French financiers were negotiating. For Britain, the prospect was alarming. The Suez Canal had become the lifeline to India, the jewel of the empire. Whoever controlled it controlled the fastest route east. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli moved with startling speed and secrecy. In November 1875, without waiting for Parliament, which was not in session, Disraeli arranged the purchase. To find the £4 million required, he turned to the banking house of Rothschild. According to the famous account, when Disraeli's secretary asked the Baron for $4 million, Rothschild reportedly ate a grape, asked what security was offered, and upon hearing the answer, the British government simply said, "You shall have it." The deal was struck. Britain acquired Egypt's canal shares for approximately £4 million. Disraeli wrote triumphantly to Queen Victoria, "You have it, madam." For Egypt, the money vanished almost immediately into the debt. £4 million against a debt approaching $100 million was a drop against a flood. It bought Ismail only a brief reprieve, weeks of breathing room in a suffocation that never eased. But for Britain, the purchase was transformative. London now held a strategic foothold inside the most important waterway on earth, and a direct financial interest in Egypt's fate. The empire had planted its flag not with soldiers, but with the banker's signature. Ismail had sold the future to survive the present. The canal that once symbolized Egyptian ambition now belonged, in large part, to a foreign power. And the sale settled nothing. The debt still loomed, vast and unpayable. Within months, Egypt would collapse into bankruptcy, and the creditors would come to collect in person. In April 1876, Egypt could no longer pretend. The treasury in Cairo held promises it could never keep, and the interest alone on nearly £100 million of debt devoured every coin that entered the state's coffers. Khedive Ismail suspended payments on the floating debt, and the bondholders of London and Paris recoiled in fury. What followed was not a rescue but a seizure disguised as accounting. In May 1876, the Caisse de la Dette Publique was established, a commission of European delegates empowered to collect Egyptian revenues before the government itself could touch them. Frenchmen, Italians, Austrians, and Britons sat in offices in Cairo and Alexandria, deciding how Egyptian taxes would be spent. The railways, the port dues, the tobacco revenues, the taxes of 4 provinces, all were pledged directly to the creditors. By late 1876, the Goshen Joubert mission arrived. 2 financiers, one British, one French, who imposed what became known as dual control. Egypt's finances were now split between 2 European nations, each guarding its bondholders. A British controller supervised revenue, a French controller supervised expenditure. The Khedive, once sovereign over the wealthiest state in Africa, could not authorize a single major payment without foreign approval. Villages along the Nile were taxed years in advance. Peasants, the fellahin, were beaten with the kirbash to surrender what little they possessed. Tax collectors extracted the harvest before it ripened. The commissioners spoke the polished language of fiscal responsibility, but their arithmetic drained the countryside to feed European ledgers. Every reform they announced served one purpose: guaranteeing the coupon payments due in Europe. Egypt's parliament, its ministries, its ambitions, all bent to the demands of accountants who answered to shareholders thousands of miles away. Ismail, watching foreigners command his revenues, understood that he had become a figurehead in his own palace. He began to resist, courting his own assembly and dismissing European ministers. But the men who now controlled Egypt's money also controlled Egypt's fate. The creditors had arrived, and they had no intention of leaving. And when a Khedive dares to defy his bankers, the bankers simply find themselves a new Khedive. By 1879, Ismail was fighting to reclaim his throne from the men who financed it. In April, he made his boldest move. He dismissed the European ministers, appointed a nationalist cabinet under Sharif Pasha, and proposed a plan that would spread the burden of debt onto the bondholders themselves. To Egyptians drowning in taxation, it was a gesture of defiance. To the financiers of London and Paris, it was intolerable rebellion. The creditors did not raise armies. They raised diplomatic pressure. Britain and France appealed to the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II, Egypt's nominal overlord in Constantinople. The bondholders wanted Ismail gone, and the great powers obliged. On June 26, 1879, a terse telegram arrived from the Sultan, addressed not to the Khedive of Egypt, but to the mere ex-Khedive Ismail Pasha. With a single sentence written in Istanbul, under European direction, the ruler who had built the Suez Canal and reshaped Cairo was stripped of his title. Ismail sailed into exile aboard his yacht, carrying jewels and furniture, leaving behind a nation mortgaged to foreigners. His son Tawfik, 27 years old and pliant, was installed in his place. Tawfik understood the arrangement perfectly. Within months, dual control returned stronger than before. A British and a French controller once again supervised every pound of revenue and expenditure. European advisors occupied the ministries. The Law of Liquidation of 1880 formalized the debt settlement, fixing interest payments and dedicating over half of Egypt's entire annual revenue to servicing foreign loans. Egyptians paid, Europeans collected. The government in Cairo functioned, but its true authority sat in the offices of Evelyn Baring and his French counterpart. A sovereign nation had been governed into submission by ledgers and legal instruments, its ruler replaced as casually as a defaulting clerk. Yet beneath this quiet conquest, resentment hardened. Egyptian army officers, taxed and humiliated, watched foreigners command their country while their own salaries went unpaid. In the barracks of Cairo, a colonel named Ahmed Urabi began to speak words the controllers feared most: Egypt for the Egyptians. The financial occupation had bred a rebellion, and the rebellion was about to explode. Colonel Ahmed Urabi was a fellow's son who had risen through the ranks of an army that Europeans now treated as an afterthought. In February 1881, he and fellow Egyptian officers marched on the Abdeen Palace to protest discrimination that favored Turkish and Circassian commanders over native Egyptians. It was a mutiny born of injustice, but it swelled into something greater. Urabi voiced what millions felt, that foreigners had seized their treasury, their taxes, and their dignity. His slogan, Egypt for the Egyptians, echoed from Alexandria to the villages of the Delta. By September 1881, Urabi led thousands of soldiers back to Abdeen and confronted Khedive Tawfik directly, demanding a constitution, a larger army, and the dismissal of the cabinet. Tawfik, protected only by his European patrons, capitulated. A nationalist government took shape, and by early 1882, Urabi himself became Minister of War, the most powerful man in Egypt. To the bondholders of London and Paris, this was catastrophe. A nationalist regime might renegotiate the debt, or repudiate it entirely, threatening the coupon payments that justified everything. In January 1882, Britain and France issued a joint note, declaring their support for the Khedive and warning against Urabi's movement. The warning inflamed, rather than calmed. In May, a combined Anglo-French fleet steamed into Alexandria's harbor, gunships visible from the shore, a floating threat aimed at the heart of Egyptian resistance. The pressure detonated on June 11, 1882. Riots erupted in Alexandria. Fighting between Egyptians and Europeans left dozens dead in the streets, foreign shops burned, and panic spread through the international quarter. The precise cause remains disputed, but the consequence was immediate and useful. European newspapers screamed of massacre. The bondholders, Governments now had exactly what they required, a pretext. France, wary of entanglement, hesitated and withdrew its fleet. But Britain did not. Prime Minister Gladstone, who had once condemned imperial adventures, authorized force to protect British interests. And those interests were financial, tangled hopelessly with the Suez Canal shares Disraeli had bought 7 years before. The warships trained their guns on the city. What had begun as a quarrel over ledgers was about to become a war. On the morning of July 11, 1882, the British Mediterranean fleet opened fire on Alexandria. For 10 hours, ironclad warships pounded the coastal forts, their heavy guns reducing stone batteries to rubble and setting the city ablaze. Urabi's forces withdrew inland, and British Marines landed among the ruins. The bombardment that began to protect bondholders had become an invasion. In August, Sir Garnet Wolseley arrived with an expeditionary army. His true objective was the Suez Canal, the waterway Egyptian labor had dug and Egyptian treasure had funded, now the strategic artery of the British Empire. Wolseley seized the canal zone at Ismailia and advanced into the desert toward Urabi's fortified lines. Before dawn on September 13, 1882, the British struck at Telephone El Kebir. In under an hour, disciplined columns overran the Egyptian entrenchments. Roughly 2,000 Egyptian soldiers were killed. British losses numbered fewer than 60. Urabi was captured, tried, and exiled to Ceylon. The nationalist dream of Egypt for the Egyptians was buried in the sand. Cairo fell within days. Tewfik was restored as a figurehead, and Britain declared its occupation temporary, a matter of restoring order and securing the debt. But the temporary lasted decades. Evelyn Baring, soon Lord Cromer, arrived in 1883 as consul general and ruled Egypt in all but name for 24 years. The Caisse de la Dette Publique continued collecting. The bondholders continued receiving their interest. British advisors ran the ministries, the army, and the finances, ensuring every pound owed to Europe flowed on schedule. British troops would not fully leave until 1956. This was the end game of a strategy that required no conquest of arms until the very last step. Egypt was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the counting houses of Paris and London, in bonds sold at ruinous discounts, in interest that outpaced any harvest, in a treasury pledged away year by year until sovereignty itself was collateral. The soldiers arrived only to guarantee the debt already collected. When the ledgers seized the revenues, the nation was already conquered. The guns merely confirmed it. And so the lesson of Egypt endures across a century of empire. Debt was the first colonizer.